Lysera drifted through the gardens that floated like jeweled clouds above her planet, her long ears catching every whisper of the wind and the faint hum of energy pulses that threaded through the vegetation. She bent over a plant that seemed to shimmer with internal light, tilting her head as the soft tendrils waved in greeting. "Honestly," she muttered, her voice a soft musical hum that carried across the hovering platforms, "if anyone ever told me I'd spend my life lecturing bioluminescent plants, I'd have laughed and said, 'Sure, and maybe humans will land tomorrow.'" She chuckled at the absurdity of it. Centuries of her people had dismissed humans as little more than bedtime stories, exaggerated tales from wandering traders, full of clumsy ships and improbable courage. Her ears twitched, a subtle sign of amusement, as she straightened and scanned the horizon. The sky above glimmered with the orbital rings of her world, satellites spinning in silent arcs like celestial dancers. Her instruments, a delicate fusion of technology and psychic resonance, whispered the usual readings. The hum of distant moons, the pulse of her floating gardens, the occasional flutter of creatures that moved like living ink blots across the air. Everything was routine, predictable, blissfully unremarkable. And then the anomaly appeared. At first, she thought it must be a malfunction, a glitch in her perception. The energy signature that registered on her sensors was erratic, almost laughably primitive. Lysera squinted at the readings, leaning closer, her long ears tipping forward in curiosity. "No," she said to herself, voice edged with disbelief. "That can't be, it shouldn't exist." Her heart, or what served as her heart, a complex network of bioenergetic nodes, skipped in a way that humans might call excitement. The signature was unmistakable. It was human. She circled her floating observation deck with a mixture of caution and irrepressible amusement. "All those myths," she murmured, "and here they are, bumbling along in their clunky little ship like drunken fireflies." The thought made her laugh, a sound that rippled through the garden and startled a flock of levitating creatures that looked like luminous jellyfish with legs. They hovered awkwardly, blinking at her in mild indignation, as if she had personally insulted their dignity. Lysera waved a hand, her humor unbothered, and muttered, "Relax, they're more ridiculous than dangerous." The vessel drew nearer, and she could see its erratic orbit as if it were trying to make a formal entrance and failing spectacularly. She raised an eyebrow, her long ears twitching in sync, and whispered, "Well, I'll be damned. Humans really do exist. And judging by that approach vector, they're not exactly stealth experts, are they?" She floated closer, her movements fluid and precise, the gardens parting with gentle nudges from her outstretched hands. She activated a subtle energy probe, not to harm, but to analyze, catalog, and, most importantly, understand. From the ship's viewport, she glimpsed a human male inside. He was wide-eyed, hands flailing over controls that seemed overly complicated for a species she had imagined as clumsy and disorganized. He muttered under his breath, a string of words that made her ears flick in amusement. "Adorable," she said softly, shaking her head. "If they think that's piloting, they haven't seen the half of it." She hovered above, letting herself be seen in fragments, just enough for him to notice the shimmer of her skin, the way her hair floated like liquid light, the unmistakable elegance of her long ears. He froze, blinking, and then reached frantically for buttons she knew would do nothing. She suppressed a laugh, letting the humor of the situation settle in. "Relax, human," she called in a voice both melodic and teasing. "I don't bite. Unless you count bad navigation as offensive behavior." The human nearly toppled from his seat, fumbling to respond. She tilted her head, long ears twitching, and noted the way his eyes darted back and forth, trying to comprehend a reality that had been considered impossible for centuries. Lysera decided to take the lead, projecting a subtle holographic message, not threatening but playful. The air shimmered with images of her floating gardens, of the bizarre creatures that dwelled there, and even a few humorous exaggerations. A plant that appeared to be reading a newspaper, another that looked like it was juggling glowing fruit. She watched the human lean closer, eyes wide in astonishment, and she couldn't help but tease him silently. "Your myths underestimated me," she thought, "but I like your enthusiasm." For the next hour, she observed him from a cautious distance, noting every nervous gesture, every faltering attempt at communication, every exasperated sigh that accompanied his fumbling commands. The more she watched, the more she realized how strange, how utterly fascinating humans were. Unpredictable, awkward, yet inherently curious, and capable of small, charming acts that made her long ears twitch with amusement. She began to understand that this encounter would not only test the boundaries of first contact, but would also stretch the limits of patience, humor, and wonder. As the sun, or what served as her planet's sun, dipped below the floating horizons, painting the gardens in amber light, Lysera allowed herself a private chuckle. "So much for myths," she whispered, glancing down at the human who was still struggling to regain composure. "They're real, clumsy, ridiculous, but real, and apparently completely unprepared for elegance." She floated closer, sensing the human's rising tension, and made a small, playful adjustment to the garden lights, causing a cascade of colors to tumble across the sky like confetti. The human blinked, laughed nervously, and she smiled, long ears swaying. Humor, she realized, might be the bridge between them. Not diplomacy, not technology, not threats, but laughter, curiosity, and the peculiar grace of someone who had lived in myths her entire life, and suddenly discovered that myths could walk, stumble, and wave awkwardly at her from the viewport of a clumsy little ship. She drifted there, silently judging, silently amused, and very much alive with anticipation. The galaxy, it seemed, had decided to send her a visitor, and she was ready to greet him on her own terms. The human ship wobbled like a drunken insect in orbit, and Lysera couldn't suppress a laugh, long ears flicking in rhythm with her amusement. "I really must admire their persistence," she murmured, watching him wrestle with controls that seemed to mock his every move. "Also, their sense of balance is questionable." She floated closer, letting the garden lights shimmer in playful patterns, teasing him without harming a hair on his head. From inside, he gawked at the impossible panorama. Gardens that defied gravity, creatures that hovered and pirouetted, and a figure that seemed to move with liquid grace through the air. He muttered a curse under his breath, trying to make sense of the reality that had been filed in his mind as legendary nonsense. Lysera observed him silently for a few minutes, letting her amusement linger. The human had energy, curiosity, and a remarkable ability to trip over his own limbs in zero gravity. She projected a holographic message, not threatening, just informative. Floating symbols and gestures, a simple, humorous greeting that twisted slightly in the air, like a wink she could have physically delivered. The human blinked, then laughed awkwardly, his nervous chuckle echoing through the ship's viewport. Communication, she thought, is going to be entertaining. She made a small adjustment to the local energy fields, causing a few of the plants to perform exaggerated dances. The human's mouth opened, shut, and then opened again, all the while fumbling with his voice module, which produced a garbled attempt at speech. Lysera tilted her head, ears twitching, and sent another wave of holographic images. Creatures attempting to juggle glowing orbs, a floating fountain that looked like it sneezed, and a small mechanical bird that collided with nothing but thin air. The human laughed outright this time, a short, relieved sound that made her pulse quicken in an unfamiliar, almost enjoyable way. He tried to respond, and she realized humans had a curious habit of overcompensating for their lack of experience with exaggerated gestures. One arm flailed toward the viewport, the other pressed desperately on a panel, and she allowed herself a private chuckle. "Yes, yes," she whispered, "show me all your chaos. I'll catalog it." She could sense his fear, his excitement, and his overwhelming need to prove competence, even as everything he thought he knew crumbled in her presence. She admired that, even if it made him look ridiculous. Finally, he managed to activate a small stabilization field, and the ship drifted closer, hovering near the edge of her gardens. Lysera let him approach, making a point of floating lazily around, long ears swaying like pendulums. "Not too close," she muttered. "Don't want him passing out from awe or gravity miscalculations." She watched him cross the threshold of the platform where she waited, every movement awkward but sincere. "Humans," she thought, "you are all inefficiency and fascination in one package." She allowed him a few tentative steps before speaking, her voice melodic yet teasing. "Welcome," she said, "to the gardens. Try not to trip over a sentient plant." The human blinked, apparently unsure whether she was joking or serious. She grinned, ears twitching. "I assure you some of them bite," she said lightly, then gestured toward a plant that puffed a tiny cloud of luminescent spores in mock threat. The human jumped back, waving his arms, and she laughed, the sound carrying softly over the floating platforms. "See," she said, amused, "your species is perfect for myth-making. Completely predictable in chaos, yet endlessly entertaining." As he relaxed, Lysera decided to test his curiosity further. She activated a small floating map, a holographic display of her system, projecting it into the space between them. Stars, moons, energy currents, and paths of ancient travelers shimmered, some moving in loops as if mocking conventional logic. The human leaned in, fascinated, tracing a finger through the projections, and she allowed herself a quiet smile. "Yes," she thought, "you may stumble, but you are intrigued. Good. Curiosity is a strong currency in first contact." She let him explore cautiously, guiding him with subtle nudges of energy, sometimes adding a tiny trick, like a plant that appeared to bow or a floating creature that circled playfully, just to see how he reacted. Each time he laughed, each time he misstepped, and each time she found herself oddly charmed by the earnestness and bumbling nature of humans. Humor, she realized, was not just a tool, it was a bridge, a way to soften the edges of tension that inevitably arose when worlds collided. Hours passed, measured by the slow orbit of distant moons, and the human began to relax fully. He marveled at the floating structures, the gravity-defying gardens, and the creatures that defied all known biological rules. Lysera guided him with dry wit, pointing out peculiarities in ways that amused both of them. "That one tends to steal small, shiny objects. Don't worry, it's polite about it," she said of a hovering creature that pecked playfully at his helmet. The human laughed, instinctively offering a small piece of equipment, which the creature accepted with apparent satisfaction. "I suspect your species would be excellent at training them," she quipped, ears flicking with subtle humor. By the time the artificial sun dipped toward the horizon, casting floating shadows across the gardens, Lysera felt a subtle change in their dynamic. The human was still awkward, still flailing in minor ways, but now there was laughter, shared curiosity, and the first fragile connection forming. She allowed herself a rare thought. Perhaps myths could become reality, not only in terrifying or serious ways, but in playful, unpredictable, and utterly human ones. The galaxy, it seemed, had delivered an unexpected visitor, and she was finding she rather enjoyed the absurdity, the novelty, and the strangely comforting humor of first contact. As they both drifted back toward a central platform, Lysera let the floating lights shimmer in cascading colors, a silent celebration of the improbable reality that humans existed, were clumsy, and yet, in their chaos, utterly captivating. She could not predict the future, could not forecast the next mistake or the next laugh, but she could enjoy the present, the absurd and wondrous collision of myth and reality, of human and alien, and of curiosity and humor intertwining in ways that made the universe feel just a little smaller and infinitely more entertaining. The human stumbled across the final stretch of the floating gardens, his movements awkward but steadily improving under Lysera's amused supervision. Each step he took prompted a subtle ripple through the local gravity fields, and a few of the plants tilted or shimmered in apparent curiosity. Lysera drifted beside him, long ears flicking in amusement, occasionally nudging his trajectory with a barely perceptible wave of energy. "No, no," she said lightly. "That's the dancing moss. Step over it, not into it, unless you want to join its interpretive choreography." The human laughed nervously, shaking his head at the absurdity. Yet he was clearly gaining confidence, learning to navigate her world with a mixture of caution, curiosity, and clumsy grace. They approached a central platform, a nexus of swirling energy and floating crystalline structures, which pulsed with the rhythm of her planet itself. Lysera paused, observing him as he glanced around, awe mixing with tentative understanding. "You're actually starting to look competent," she teased, ears twitching with satisfaction. "I might have to add you to the record of minor achievements for humans. Rare, but it exists." The human grinned. The awkwardness of earlier encounters softened into a kind of camaraderie. He realized that his fear had been replaced by fascination, and that fascination had grown into something quietly joyful. As they moved deeper into the platform, Lysera introduced him to creatures that hovered lazily, some shimmering with translucent colors, others emitting low, musical hums that resonated through the air. One in particular, a small, spherical entity with dozens of tiny, feathery limbs, floated toward him, curious. The human reached out instinctively, and the creature twirled in delight, landing lightly on his shoulder. Lysera's laughter rang out, soft and melodic. "Careful," she said teasingly. "That one thinks highly of humans, which can be dangerous for their egos." The human chuckled, feeling a rare sense of belonging in a world that had seemed utterly alien just hours before. Lysera guided him to the final section of the gardens, where a shimmering dome of energy pulsed like a heartbeat. This was the heart of her territory, the nexus where all the planet's floating structures and creatures converged. She waved her hands, and the energy dome responded, patterns spiraling in intricate designs that mirrored the flow of time itself on her world. "This is where myths meet reality," she said softly, the humor in her voice tempered by genuine reverence. The human watched, entranced, realizing that this planet and its inhabitant was far more intricate than any story he had ever heard. He turned to her, eyes wide and earnest. I thought humans were just stories," he said, voice hesitant but steady. Lysera's ears twitched, and she allowed herself a rare smile, one that held centuries of skepticism, curiosity, and now amusement at the unfolding reality. "And yet," she replied, "here you are proving that myths sometimes have legs or wings, apparently." She gestured at his ship, wobbling gently nearby. Clumsy, unpredictable, but undeniably real. He laughed, a sound mingling relief and wonder, and she realized that the laughter itself had become a bridge between their species. As they explored the dome together, Lysera showed him the delicate balance of energy streams, the way plants and creatures communicated through pulses of light and vibration, and the subtle humor woven into the ecosystem. A small plant shot a luminescent vine toward him, wrapping loosely around his wrist, and he yelped in surprise. "Friendly," Lysera said, long ears twitching. "Mostly, sometimes sarcastic." The human laughed again, learning that humor, like curiosity, was a universal language. Hours passed in a kind of shared rhythm, and Lysera sensed a shift in herself as well. The centuries of isolation, of skepticism toward human myths, melted slightly in the warmth of companionship. She found herself enjoying his mistakes, his missteps, and even his occasional bursts of bravado. The human, for his part, had grown in confidence and understanding, beginning to see her world not as incomprehensible, but as a place rich with wonder, humor, and subtle lessons. When the artificial sun began its descent, casting long, dancing shadows across the floating gardens, Lysera guided him back toward his ship. The human paused, looking around as if memorizing every floating structure, every luminescent creature, every ripple of energy. I don't